Caught my dad cheating while my mom was recovering from a stroke. He left us when I confronted him and now blames me for his divorce.
Growing up, I was always really close to my mom.
Being close to her wasn't hard at all. She's honestly the kindest person I've ever known. From as far back as I can remember, she's treated me more like her best friend than just her daughter. My mom has always been the kind of person who gets along well with other women, so I never had to worry about her judging me or scolding me when I opened up to her. We'd do so much together: shopping trips, movie nights, even going to the salon for our hair. But don't get me wrong, as easygoing as she was, she still made sure I had boundaries. I had a curfew, and I knew where the line was, so I didn't push it. My dad, though, was a completely different story. I've always had this feeling that he never really wanted to be a dad in the first place. Even though he was a stay-at-home parent, he barely spent any time with me. Outside of dropping me off and picking me up from school, he was usually holed up in his room playing video games. There were countless days when my mom would come home from work only to find him still glued to the screen, dinner uncooked, and the house chores untouched. That would always lead to a big argument, and my dad would usually storm out, slamming the door behind him. It wasn't until I got older that I began to fully understand just how toxic his behavior was. My mom would plead with him to help out around the house or at least try to find a job, but he always had some excuse. He'd claim that playing video games was research to help him when he eventually found work, though that one never seemed to come. According to my mom, my dad used to have a solid job in computer science, but he lost it when his company downsized shortly after she got pregnant with me. That's when he tried to convince her to have an abortion, but she refused. They struck a deal instead. She'd work to support us while he stayed home temporarily to take care of me and handle the housework. The key word there was temporary. He was supposed to go back to work eventually, but he never did. When I was about 6, even some of the kids at school would tease me because my dad didn't have a job. Their parents would apparently gossip about my family, and it made its way to the playground. It wasn't just that he didn't work, he also let himself go, gaining weight and refusing to take care of himself. He'd often ask the other moms in the neighborhood to take me to school because he was too lazy to wake up on time. There were even days when he forgot to pick me up, and I'd have to rely on the parents of my classmates to give me a ride home. I'd come inside, and there he'd be either playing video games or napping, like nothing in the world mattered. It wasn't long before my mom had had enough. She packed up our things, and we left. We moved into my grandparents' house for a while, and I can still remember the day my dad showed up, trying to convince my mom not to go through with the divorce. My grandparents backed her up, warning him that if he didn't change, it was over. Surprisingly, he seemed to get the message. He started waking up early to go running every morning. He'd pick me up and drop me off at my grandparents' house, chatting with me on the way. On weekends, he'd take me to the park to teach me how to play badminton. For the first time, I actually started to enjoy spending time with him. I think my mom noticed the shift in him too because, after a lot of discussions, she decided to give him another chance. We moved back in with him, and over time, he began to turn his life around. He lost weight, started living healthier, and even found a job. It didn't pay as much as my mom's, but it was a step in the right direction. You'd think that would have been the happy ending to our story, but it was really just the start of a new chapter. Not long after he started working again, my dad's behavior changed. He began coming home late and was constantly glued to his phone. If I tried to talk to him, he'd brush me off like I wasn't even there. He stopped spending any quality time with me, slipping back into his old, distant ways. My mom grew more suspicious as the weeks went on. She tried talking to him about it, but he'd dismiss her concerns, saying she was overreacting. Turns out, her instincts were spot on. One day, she found inappropriate messages between my dad and his personal trainer. That discovery blew everything up. My mom was furious, and their fight was louder and uglier than anything I'd ever seen. My dad was angry too, not because of what he'd done, but because my mom had looked through his phone. He kept calling her a backstabber. Then, things got even worse. The argument turned physical, and one of his punches accidentally hit my mom in the face, giving her a nosebleed. I was terrified. Seeing my mom hurt like that, with blood dripping down her face, made me cry uncontrollably. I thought she might die. On the way to the hospital, my dad told me I wasn't allowed to tell anyone what had really happened. He warned me that if I told the truth, he'd be taken away, and it'd be my fault. As a kid, the thought of being responsible for something like that was too much, so I stayed quiet. After my mom recovered, my dad promised to cut ties with his trainer and vowed to change for good. My mom didn't file any charges, and once she got better, they went back to living as though nothing had ever happened.
When I was 11, my mom and I had a summer tradition.
Every year, she'd take me to visit her best friend from college, Tessa, and Tessa's husband, Larry. They had a cabin, and we'd spend a week or two there. It was always a good time since Tessa's nieces and nephews would also visit, and we'd play together the whole time. My dad usually stayed behind on these trips, but one summer, he decided to join us. For the first few days, everything seemed normal.
But one sunny afternoon, I was feeling restless.
I couldn't settle down with a book or take a nap, so I decided to wander into the woods nearby for a walk.
I wish I hadn't.
As I walked, I stumbled upon something I wish I could erase from my memory: my dad and Tessa, making out in broad daylight.
They weren't even trying to hide it.
If my mom or Larry had wandered into the woods at that moment, they would have seen them just as clearly as I did.
I was horrified. My stomach churned, and I felt like I might throw up.
I ran back to the cabin as quietly as I could, my heart pounding.
I didn't know what to do.
I was scared of my dad's reaction if he found out I knew, but I also felt like I'd be betraying my mom if I kept quiet.
Thankfully, I didn't have to stay silent for long.
Larry caught them a few days later, out by the lake, kissing. He flew into a rage and punched my dad, giving him a black eye. When my mom found out, she was furious. She went after both of them, yelling and attacking them until Larry had to physically hold her back. My mom was devastated.
Tessa wasn't just her best friend, she thought of her as a sister. She couldn't believe the betrayal. Tessa and my dad tried to play it off like it was a one-time mistake.
My dad even tried to blame it all on Tessa, claiming she made the first move and that he just got caught up in the moment. They swore up and down that it wouldn't happen again, but I knew they were lying. I'd seen them before, and I could have exposed them if I wanted to. But at 11 years old, I wasn't sure if speaking up was the right thing to do. Somehow, those two managed to convince both my mom and Larry that it was just a drunken mistake. My mom didn't stick around to hear more apologies. She announced we were leaving, and no matter how much Tessa begged, my mom was done with her.
That was the last time I ever saw Tessa.
Looking back, it's heartbreaking to think about everything my mom went through because of my dad. I've never understood why she stayed with him after each betrayal. I wish she'd left him for good back then. Our lives wouldn't have been worse off without him.
When I was 16, everything changed again.
My mom had a serious stroke while she was driving, which caused an accident. Thankfully, she survived, but she was never the same. Overnight, our world turned upside down. She was bedridden, recovering from a spinal injury. She couldn't move on her own, let alone walk, and even the slightest motion caused her terrible pain.
My grandparents stepped in to help.
They took turns staying with us, caring for her since my dad refused to hire a full-time nurse. He said it was too expensive, but I think he just didn't want to bother. After school, I'd sit with my mom, talking to her as she drifted in and out from her medication. I'd rub her feet, help change her diapers, and do whatever I could to make her more comfortable. It only took 2 months before my dad started complaining. He kept going on about how expensive everything was now that my mom wasn't working and how her insurance wasn't covering enough of her bills.
It infuriated me.
My mom had done so much for our family, and now, when she needed us most, all he could do was whine.
My grandparents offered to help financially.
My grandmother even handed over some of her jewelry so my dad could pawn it to cover expenses. But as time went on, he kept asking for more, taking every dollar they offered under the guise of helping my mom or paying bills. I knew what kind of person my dad was, so it didn't take long for me to grow suspicious. I noticed him spending more and more time on his phone, just like he used to before. One day, I decided to investigate. I came up with a plan to check his messages through his MacBook, and that's when I discovered he was constantly chatting with someone named Camille. I didn't dig too deep into their conversations, it felt wrong, but from what I did see, it was obvious that he was cheating on my mom again. This time, the stakes were so much higher. My mom was already fragile, both physically and emotionally, and I couldn't imagine how crushed she'd be if she found out. I was furious and determined to do something about it. I managed to grab my dad's phone, delete all the messages, and block Camille's number, hoping she'd leave him alone. I thought I'd done the right thing, but of course, I was naive. My dad noticed Camille had been blocked and quickly figured out that I was the one who'd done it. He confronted me, his voice booming as he demanded to know how I dared to touch his phone. I tried to hold back, but the frustration and anger that had been building inside me for years exploded. I yelled right back at him, telling him I was done watching him cheat on my mom over and over again. His face flushed with embarrassment, and for a moment, he seemed caught off guard. Then he tried to play it off, acting innocent and saying I didn't understand what was really going on, that I was too young to get it, and that I needed to mind my own business. That only made me angrier. I shot back, telling him not only did I know about Camille, but I had also seen him kissing Tessa all those years ago. I told him I'd known since I was 11 what kind of person he really was. He went pale at first but quickly tried to regain control, accusing me of being disrespectful and saying I had no right to talk to him like that. He tried to guilt me, claiming that as my father, he deserved my respect. But I wasn't holding back anymore. I told him I was ashamed to have him as a dad and that I wished he wasn't my father. Looking back, I'm not sure I meant it, but in the heat of the moment, it came out. That seemed to hit him where it hurt. His face changed, and he asked me if I really meant it. I nodded, my voice shaking with anger as I told him I was tired of watching him hurt Mom and that she deserved so much better than him. At that moment, my grandmother walked into the living room. She must have heard our shouting because she looked worried. She glanced between us, instantly sensing the tension. My dad, flustered and defensive, started blustering about how I was being disrespectful and how this was none of my business. He kept saying I was too young to understand, but I wasn't buying it. I stood my ground, telling him everything I'd been holding in for years. I pointed out how all my classmates had happy families where dads didn't cheat on their wives. I told him I was tired of pretending everything was fine and tired of watching him betray my mom while I stayed silent. I guess hearing it all out loud shook him, because the next thing I knew, he snapped. With an angry declaration, he announced he was done with us. I watched, stunned, as he stormed off to pack his bags. My grandmother and I trailed after him, both in shock. She begged him to stop, asking him what he thought he was doing. He just kept going, muttering that this was why he never wanted kids, because they ruin everything. He said he'd tried his best to stick around for Mom during this tough time, but after what I'd said, he couldn't do it anymore. Then he dropped the bombshell, he was leaving to be with Camille. He claimed she loved him and made him happy, and he didn't deserve to be treated poorly by us. My grandmother, furious, called him a pathetic, deadbeat father, but it didn't faze him. He had already made up his mind. The last thing I remember is watching him walk out the door, bags in hand. He didn't even look back. Everything happened so fast that I didn't know how to process it. 1 minute, I was standing up for my mom, and the next, my dad was gone. I burst into tears, blaming myself. I felt like I'd driven him away, like it was my fault he left. My grandmother held me, telling me it wasn't my fault, that my dad had been looking for an excuse to leave for a long time. She said he was a coward who didn't have the decency to be honest about it. But I struggled to believe her. It was my words that had pushed him over the edge. The hardest part was breaking the news to my mom. I didn't want to hurt her or set back her recovery. We waited until my granddad came home, and together, we sat with her to tell her what had happened. To my surprise, my mom took it better than I expected. She looked shocked at first and tried to call my dad, but he didn't answer. After a few moments, she sighed, as if she'd expected this all alone. She saw the fear in my eyes and pulled me into a hug, telling me it wasn't my fault. She said she had always known he was a coward deep down. I broke down in her arms, apologizing over and over, but she just held me and told me she was proud of me for speaking up. She said she had no idea how much I'd been holding inside all these years just to protect her. She promised we'd be okay without him, and somehow, I believed her. Over the next few months, we focused on getting through each day. My grandparents moved in with us full-time to help care for my mom, and they were an incredible support. With their help, I could go to school knowing my mom was being looked after. I even started tutoring a few students after school to bring in a little extra money. It wasn't much, but I wanted to help however I could. Meanwhile, my dad was completely out of the picture. He didn't call or text, not even to check on my mom. I sent him a few messages, apologizing and asking him to come back, but he never replied. It was surreal to realize my own father didn't care enough to see if we were okay. Even though it hurt, I began to understand something important during that time: we were better off without him. When my mom finally recovered and was able to walk and move around like her old self, it felt nothing short of a miracle. The doctors told us she was completely fine, and to this day, I'm so grateful to God for bringing her back to health. Those months had drained us mentally, physically, emotionally, but seeing her smiling and full of life again made every struggle feel worth it. The first thing she did once she was better was contact a divorce lawyer. She was ready to put an end to her marriage with my dad. If you're wondering why he hadn't filed for divorce himself despite moving out, it was clear he didn't want to deal with the financial responsibilities. He was avoiding child support and health insurance, knowing full well how tough things had been for her. But my mom? She was done. She was tired of the lies, the betrayal, and the manipulation. When the papers were ready, she tried to contact him to figure out where to send them. That's when, after months of no contact, my dad finally reached out. He had apparently read her texts about the divorce and called her in a panic. He wanted to know if she was serious. My mom didn't hesitate. She told him, plain and simple, that she was absolutely serious and that this divorce was happening, whether he liked it or not. And then came the excuses. My dad started begging her not to go through with it. He told her his girlfriend had dumped him just a few weeks after he left us, and he'd been living alone in some rundown motel ever since. He said he'd been trying to save face, too embarrassed to come back home, but that he'd always assumed she'd eventually call him, and they'd work things out. He claimed he never thought she'd actually file for divorce. He pleaded with her to think it over, saying they could have an honest conversation now that she was better, but my mom wasn't buying it. She told him firmly that if he didn't sign the papers, she'd take him to court. From the way their conversation ended, I'm not sure if he agreed or not, but it didn't seem to matter. She wasn't backing down. After that call, he started targeting me. I've been getting messages and voicemails from him non-stop. In the ones I've listened to, he's furious, yelling that I ruined his life and that their divorce is my fault. He even said he wishes I had never been born. It was like a punch to the gut hearing those words, even though deep down, I know it's just him lashing out. I showed everything to my mom, and she was livid. She told me not to let his manipulative words get to me, that he's just trying to deflect blame because he can't take responsibility for his own actions. But, if I'm honest, a part of me still feels guilty. I wonder if I pushed him too far that day, if maybe I am the reason he walked out. My mom says I'm not, but it's hard to shake the doubt. That's why I decided to share my story online, to ask for advice, to see if anyone else blames me the way my dad does. Am I the asshole for losing my temper and setting off this chain of events? Could I have handled things differently, or was I right to stand up to him? I feel like my mom's trying to shield me from the truth because she loves me, but I need honesty. I don't want to be the reason she's unhappy. Update 1: I've been crying while reading all your comments. I never realized so many strangers out there have gone through similar pain, and for the first time, I don't feel so alone. Growing up, I thought everyone else's life was perfect. I've learned now that everyone has their own struggles and stories to tell. Some of you have blamed me for my parents' divorce, and honestly, I still feel a little guilty. But reading your stories has made me realize that I was right to speak my mind. I didn't force my dad to cheat, and I didn't make him leave us. Those were his choices, not mine. And to clarify, I'm glad my parents are divorcing. My mom deserves better, and I think she's finally realized that too. For those asking, no, we don't own our house. We rent it, and with all the expenses from my mom's treatment, she doesn't have any assets left. The divorce won't change much financially,
but at least it'll bring closure. Update 2. It's been a month since my last update, and a lot has happened.
Out of nowhere, my dad showed up at our doorstep. It was the first time I'd seen him in months. He looked rough, disheveled, with a thick beard that made him look like a different person. My grandparents initially refused to let him in, but he stood there apologizing, saying he just wanted one last conversation with my mom. Eventually, she agreed to hear him out. He broke down almost immediately, apologizing for everything he'd done. He said he'd had time to think and realized how much he had taken her for granted. He told her she was the perfect woman for him, someone he should have cherished from the start. He admitted Camille wasn't even half the woman my mom is and that living with her had been a disaster. He explained that he'd met Camille online and thought he was stepping into some fairy tale relationship, but it turned out to be the opposite. They fought constantly, and eventually, Camille kicked him out in the middle of the night, leaving him homeless. With no place to go, he ended up living in a cheap motel. He admitted to spending most of his evenings drinking alone, which caused him to start showing up late for work. It wasn't long before he was fired. Sitting in our living room, he broke down in tears, begging my mom for forgiveness and promising that he'd change his ways. I know it sounds like something out of a dramatic soap opera, but knowing my dad and his manipulative tendencies, I couldn't hold back a laugh. Even his tears looked fake, forced and desperate. My mom didn't buy into his act either. She calmly smiled and told him to stop the charade. Then, she handed him the divorce papers and said he needed to sign them right then and there so she could file. At first, he refused. But my grandparents, who'd had enough of his antics, weren't going to let him off so easily. They reminded him about the thousands of dollars he had taken from them, money and jewelry he'd claimed were for family expenses. They made it clear that if he didn't cooperate, they'd investigate his finances and take legal action. My mom added that the longer he dragged this out, the more he'd end up paying in lawyer fees. Between their united front and the mountain of evidence we had against him, my dad realized he had no way out. Even then, he had the audacity to turn to me and ask, "Are you happy with what you've done?" He shook his head in disgust, as if I was somehow to blame for his downfall. That only made me laugh harder. The absurdity of him trying to pin this on me when he was the one who cheated, lied, and abandoned us was almost too much to handle. My mom, furious, told him to stop acting like an entitled jerk. She reminded him that his actions, his betrayals, had led him here, not me. My laughter seemed to irritate him further. He glared at me, muttering curses under his breath. But my grandfather wasn't having it. He shoved a pen into my dad's hand and demanded that he sign the papers and leave. Seeing my entire family stand up to him was empowering, and in the end, he had no choice but to sign. Before he left, my mom turned to me and promised that this would be the last time I'd ever have to see him. She didn't want him coming anywhere near me or causing me any more pain. Update 3. Hey, everyone. It's been a few months since my last update, and I'm happy to share that my parents are officially divorced. It wasn't an easy process, but it's finally over, and I feel like a massive weight has been lifted. My dad has been court-ordered to cover my college expenses until I graduate, which feels like some well-deserved karma. He's done so little for me over the years, so it's about time he's held accountable for something. As for my mom, she's doing well. She's focusing on her health and has started a regular exercise routine to stay active. It's been a long road, but she's finally starting to smile again. My grandparents, who had been living with us during her recovery, have moved back to their home, though we visit them every weekend. I've grown so attached to them during this time, they've been my rock. Financially, things are tight. My mom is looking for a new job, and I'm still tutoring to help out. Even so, we both agree that we feel freer now than we ever did before. It's like a dark cloud has finally lifted. A lot of you asked why my dad kept blaming me, and honestly, it's clear now that he was just terrified of losing someone as dependable as my mom. Instead of owning up to his mistakes, he tried to deflect the blame onto me because it was easier for him. But I'm not carrying that guilt anymore. I see things much more clearly now, and I'm proud I stood up to him that day. On a personal note, I've taken some of your advice to heart. I've decided to start therapy once I'm in college, and I've also begun journaling. It's surprising how much clarity and peace writing things down can bring.
It's been a big help in processing everything that's happened. To everyone who offered support and encouragement over these past few months, thank you. Your kindness and understanding have meant the world to me, and I can't express how much it's helped me through this difficult time. I've decided not to delete this post because I want it to stay here for anyone who might be going through something similar. If my story can bring even a little bit of comfort to someone else, then it's worth keeping up. Things do get better with time, and I hope this post is proof of that.